The virtual floor is yours, my friend.
Awesome. All right. So, oh, hang on, I got to move this so that I can actually see my slides. So that's the wrong button. I know how to use this software. All right. So this is going to be web components, vanilla and lit framework. So we're going to talk a little bit about how to build web components without a framework of any kind. And then we're going to touch on what's relatively a new framework, but it has had its like components around for quite some time, called lit. Yeah, please feel free to stop and ask any questions if you have any. Today I'm representing CoderPad. That's my company. We do technical interviewing software, and I'll actually be using it throughout as our IDE. So get to show that off a little bit. So let's start by answering like a super simple question, like what are components, right? If you use React, Vue, Angular, you're probably already familiar with these concepts. But the idea is basically creating new HTML tags with maybe some custom UI or logic, right? So like here, you could kind of break down like a page.html file into page header, page content, page footer, right? Those are like really big components that might have multiple tags inside of them. So like page headers might have a nav link, and then inside that nav, you might have multiple A tags. So, they can kind of be expanded. But you could also do like components that are more similar to like a button, right? Where they're like a one and done and you're able to reuse them all over the place, right? The benefits of having a components is that like one, you get to reuse it kind of everywhere throughout your application. So if you have a standardized button that you want to have look the same and act the same for the most part, you can kind of sprinkle that across your app and have the UI and logic made consistent everywhere. You can also like compose them, right? So most of these components, you can have children that you pass to them, and you can have kind of, treat them as if they're structuring your application. So very composable, very consolidated. So making sure that, your header logic is in your header component instead of like kind of intermingled with the rest of your code and making things a little bit harder to read. You can kind of consolidate your code to where they're relevant, right? So talking about a quick history of web components in particular. Web components is a standard. It is now built into like most major web browsers, Safari, Firefox, Chrome, all the good stuff. It was introduced originally in 2011 at a conference, didn't really hit, I want to say it was like a really early specification, like a 0 point something. In 2013, 2 libraries released. One of them is React, which does not use web components at its core. It uses a renderer basically. And then Polymer, which did use web components, was also released. In 2016, web components kind of like got really, really big enough to be able to have YouTube completely rewritten in Polymer, which use web components. And that was really exciting. And then 2018, 2 things happened of note. Polymer announced that they were like, hey, we're going to be changing a bunch of things and we're going to be focusing on what is now lit. And Firefox enabled web components by default. So made them much, much, much. You could polyfill them before to get them to work on other browsers. But now it's like, okay, you don't need to polyfill. They work right out of the box, right? So nowadays, web components are thoroughly supported in the browsers, or at least the mainstream browsers. IE11, you might have to polyfill still, but work pretty well. So let's start by talking about vanilla JS. And when I say vanilla JavaScript, I just mean JavaScript without an additional framework, just utilizing the browser APIs, right? So in web components, we have 4 different lifecycles. We're only going to be touching on 3 today because one of them is a bit niche. But if you're familiar with React, you might be familiar with like the concept of rendering or unrendering a component in something like component did mount or use effect with no dependency array. That's very similar to connected callback and disconnected callback. Both of those are ran when a component is added to the DOM and removed from the DOM. There's one where a component is moved from one part of the document tree to another. And then finally, there's attribute change callback, which is essentially a way to say, hey, all of these attributes have changed. What do we want to do with them, right? So we'll be running through connected, disconnected, and attribute changed. I'm not going to be going too far into adopted callback because I think that's a little bit more of a niche use case that is for library authors. But I mean, it's useful to be there. It's just not something that, I'm going to be touching on too much today. So let's start with the connection lifecycles, right? So this is a super basic HTML web component. So we have a class that extends HTML element. we have two methods here. One of them is connected callback. One of them is disconnected callback. And then we're able to define that custom element using custom elements.define, and we're able to name that, right? So we can change the HTML in the connected callback using this.innerHTML, just like any other HTML element. And then when it's connected and disconnected, it'll do a console log. So if we take a look at this running in progress, so this is the web component. There's nothing else going on here. That's all there is. This is basically some logic that says when this, here, let me run it. When this button is triggered, if it is shown, go ahead and, if it should be shown, go ahead and add it back to the DOM. If it isn't shown, go ahead and remove it from this div, right? So if we hit toggle back and forth, ta-da. Actually, I need to open my consoles for you to see the console logs, but you can see that it will console log when it is leaving or connecting, right? So pretty straightforward. Like web or like React or other frameworks, you can use these callbacks to say, add an event listener or do some type of setup that you can then clean up later. All sorts of stuff you can do here. There's also attribute changed, right? So you'll see that attribute change is a method. It takes the name, so what attribute changed, the name of it, and then what the previous value was and what the new value is. Here inside of our attribute change callback, we're literally just saying to render again. Doesn't have to be called render, it's just what we're calling it for simplicity. But you'll notice that we also have to have a static method called get observed attributes, right? And that we're returning the message. Right. So if we look at our demo, we can see here that message is being bound to an attribute saying hello world, and that we have an ID here. Apologies if you can hear my roommates in the background and their kids. So on click, it'll basically select one of these randomly, and then change the attribute value, right? So if I change this, we can actually see in our HTML, we can see the message attribute changing. And then in our observed attributes, messages is changing. So we're tracking to make sure that that's changing. But if we were to change, say, any other attribute like ASDF, since we're not tracking it, this render function won't change. So just something to keep in mind. Yeah, all we're doing is we're checking this dot attributes, which gives us a node dot value, which is the string value. And then we're able to render that into our inner HTML. Let's talk. So now that we know how to be able to update the attributes, right? Let's talk about some of the limitations around attributes, right? And this is true for any HTML attributes, whether you're using web components or not. Attributes in HTML can only be a string. You can't have an array. You can't even really have a number or a Boolean. They're still string representations of those values, right? So when you set an attribute like disabled equals true, that is a string being passed to the element, and maybe the element might coerce that into a Boolean, but either way, it is going to be a string passed in. So if you want to use an attribute to pass in an array or an object or anything like that, you have to first serialize it, right? A very common way of doing serialization is using something called JSON, which you may be familiar with from using like endpoint calls with REST APIs or whatnot. Here we can do a simple JSON.stringify to convert this array of objects into a string. And then on the other end, we could do something like a JSON.parse to turn that back into an object, or an array of objects. The astute of people who know about serialization will know that there's going to be a problem that comes up later, but we will be addressing that as well. So hold tight. Let's look at a super simple way of how to pass an array of strings, right? So here we're passing to-dos, and you'll notice that they're comma separated. And this is what happens when you try to pass an array without doing serialization, right? So here we're literally saying there's an array, right, on to-do list, and then given that array, update the attribute, right? Well, the problem is that the array of 1, 2 ran through the .toString method, which is ran implicitly when you try to bind to a string. gets turned into 1, 2 without an array, right? So I can't easily do a JSON parse up here. So when I add an item, say to this to-do list, you'll notice that it's not printing in a UL or any type of order. It's just a string, right? So let's change that. Let's try to pass an array of strings using serialization properly. So here we can use JSON.stringify in the parent where it passes it to. And then you'll notice inside of this render function, we have JSON.parse. And then when we parse that, we're able to do a map on that array, turn that into a string of li, join it with new lines, and then change the inner HTML to be essentially ul, li, etc. So here we can see that now when we're changing the attributes, we're doing JSON.stringify that array up there, right? And now if we click run, we add some items, you'll notice that they're being actually rendered as a list properly, right? And if we take a look at our HTML, I zoomed in too much there, I think. You'll notice that our to-dos is now being serialized into a string that is JSON encoded, and then we can decode that later on, right? So now that we understand how to do serialization, let's see how we can use that to pass objects, right? So here, let me actually run the demo really quick because I think it'll be faster. So here you can see that we have an object in our to-do list that contains name, which is a string, and completed, which is a Boolean, right? So we can add items. And now if we look at our HTML, we can see that it's again encoded as an array of objects using JSON, and then JSON's able to parse that. And now that it's been parsed, it's a full object, so we can do a map. That map can conditionally show the checked attribute, which is what shows that, right? So if I toggle it, it'll show checked or not. Or there's to do, right? So, or we can show the name, and then again, we combine them into a string and show them in a UL, right? So pretty simple way to convert from an object. Now, you'll notice, if I go back to this really quickly, you'll notice that if I click one of these and then I hit toggle, that is still checked, right? But if I like click on one of those, it's not actually updating to-do list here, right? So what if we did something like pass a callback, right? A function here that's something along the lines of onChange, and we say toggle to do, right? So we want, every time this changes, we want to update this to-do list and cause a re-render, right? So we can do that with a function, right? So let's say that, let's check that out. Let's look at here. We have name completed just like before, but now we also have an ID. It's literally as simple as the number that we're incrementing, nothing fancy. And then on change, right? So we're trying to pass on change. This will toggle the to do, and basically that's all it'll do. It'll change the completed state and then it'll re-render, right? But there's a few problems now. First, we can't use strings anymore, right? Because when we were using strings here, input type checkbox, how do we bind an event, right? How do we bind a click event or a change event? We can't realistically do that without like naming the function and doing all sorts of stuff. Like it gets really, really complicated. We can't just pass an arbitrary function to it, right? So now what we have to do is we have to manually create an input using document.createElement. Then we have to change the type. Then we have to add the event listener, which this also isn't fully correct because we should also be removing the event listener later, but pretend I didn't say that. We're also going to change checked, and then we'll append it to li. Like this is getting pretty terse, right? Or pretty verbose. So it's a little complicated to read, but you'll notice that if I click run, and if I add a few items, you'll notice if I toggle them all, this number is correct, right? Because we're trying to find how many items are completed. But if I check them individually, nothing is happening, even though our change handler is working, right? So why is that? The reason for that is because when we do our JSON stringify of this to-do list, this function is like a piece of memory, right? And you can't realistically serialize, at least not safely, that piece of memory to be able to pass. So this function is kind of lost, right? If we console log our to do, right, and we look at our console, you'll see that we have an object which has completed ID name, but the function that we tried to serialize is omitted entirely. So we can't serialize all objects. And this is a great example of where serialization fails. So how do we work around that? If you can't pass to an attribute, can you pass data without serializing? And the answer is yes, you can. You need to be able to serialize, or you need to be able to pass by property instead of passing by attribute. So the way that this is done is we have to-dos here, right? To-dos is just an empty array, and that's a property on this custom element. And then we have set to-dos, which is a function that you can call, and it sets the to-dos, and then it clears the long story short, it re-renders, right? So let's take a look at that really quick. So you'll notice that we haven't changed very much of this, right? The custom input creation is still there. The header is still there, all that, right? The only difference is that instead of doing a JSON.stringify, now we do a document query to get a reference to this component. And then we do .set to-dos, since that's on the primitive now, or prototype now. And now we can call set to-dos, right? So if we run this, change, now the header is updated properly as we would expect it to be, right? So this is how you're able to kind of get around that serialization. There's some benefits here, right? You can, it's faster than attributes, right? Because you're not having to serialize that data. You're literally just passing a reference to that data, right? So it's significantly faster. You don't have to do any duplication of any kind. Props can be any type. So you'll notice that we're passing functions. We could also pass symbols or iterables. We could pass basically anything JavaScript allows, right? And the other thing is that if we go look at our HTML, whereas before, if you were doing a scripting and you're like, oh no, like now it's cluttering up my HTML when I'm debugging, it's not there anymore, right? You don't have to visually see the results that are being passed in, which can be nice in some circumstances as well. So that's as far as we're going to go with vanilla JavaScript right now. Now let's talk about Lit framework. And you'll notice that things are going to look a little bit different. I'll mention the pros and the cons of each of these at the end. And hopefully you'll be able to choose your own decision based on like what you've been able to see, right? So let's go back to looking at that attribute change, right? All we need to do is set our properties, right? So messages of type string. This is JavaScript, by the way, to be clear, this is not TypeScript. You're probably a little confused as to why there's a type, right? If you've ever used prop types, which is from the React world in pure JavaScript, which was a way to like enforce input type being sanitization, this is very similar. So messages, right? And then all we do is re-render, right? Lit handles all the re-rendering for us, no problem. So if we take a look at our code, you can see that, you can see that like if we run it and we toggle it, re-renders no problem, right? You'll also notice that we've rewritten the way that we toggle this, right? So we're creating a second lit component to be able to store the message and kind of consolidate this logic, right? So you'll notice that we're using @click. So we're arbitrarily binding the click event. We no longer have to do document.query or any of that. And then we're doing change message, right? Which just goes, looks up the new message and binds it. And when that message changes, automatically re-renders, right? So what used to be a query select, and then in that query select, you had to handle a bunch of this stuff. It's kind of just consolidated now, right? We have two components. We have the parent component that changes the message, and then the child component that renders that message. Pretty straightforward, right? We can also take a look at that string array passing, right? So this is using the serializable method where we're passing via attribute. So here we have our to-do list, right? When you submit that form, so we're using @submit on the form, it checks the input value, right? Which is being changed by that .change and that value bind. So we're binding the change event and the value event. So it's kind of a two-way binding that we're able to set. And then update that to-do list, right? Pretty straightforward. So here we can see, again, the component that renders is just rendering the to-do string. And then we're defining the to-dos, right? So pretty similar demo to what we had before. But again, this is just strings, right? So if you remember last time, when we wanted to change to UL, it was like this kind of arcane nightmare, right? Like, okay, we had to do a parse and then we have to run a map and all this other stuff. Like, it wasn't very clean, right? So this is the new way of doing it. Instead of doing to-dos equal something, you do a dot to-dos. The period at the very beginning means that you're binding to a property and not an attribute. So that means that you can pass objects, functions, everything else, just like we talked. You don't have to serialize it. And now we can just use repeat, which is built into lit, and pass it an li. That's it. You don't need to do any element query. You don't need to do anything else. Just works, right? So if we run this, we can see this to do. That's it. Pretty straightforward. We also have the ability to do object array passing, right? So just as before, when we had the object, we can pass completed, we can pass the to-do, the repeat, right? And then inside of here, we just update the to-dos. Something that's important to mention is that the original version of this had this.to-do list.push. That will not work in lit. The reason why it won't work in lit is because it doesn't know how to automatically run render unless if you not mutate, but set a new instance of a variable. So it's like a change detection. If you're familiar with Angular's change detection, it's very similar. Vue has some limitations similar to this, but if you're familiar with like explicit change detection where you have to change the object and not just mutate it, very similar. So that's pretty simple to work around. We just spread the list and then add an item, basically concatenating it and assigning that new list to the variable, right? That's it. We can look at that demo really quick. And again, now we have checkboxes, right? And to-dos, the toggle all does the same thing. It's just doing a map, right? Pretty straightforward. Now, let's look at how we do functions, right? Before we had to do the input.checkbox and we had to do the add event, we had to do like all this other stuff. It was something like 30 lines of code, right? It's now 3 lines of code. In our HTML, we add input, we do @checked, and then we pass the function, and then .checked, @change is the function, and .checked is the Boolean. That's it. That's all we do. So here, we can run. We can add a few of these, and you'll notice that the counter is updating as it should, and that's it. Right, so that on change, this submit function hasn't changed very much. Most of this hasn't changed. The only difference is the HTML is now significantly easier, right? And you'll notice that we have the header text, like the length, running on every render to update that as often as they can, right? So yeah, pretty straightforward. So what are the pros of using vanilla web components, pros and cons, right? So we'll start with the pros. This is kind of like whenever you're using standards, right? The big benefit is that you don't have this like arcane knowledge that won't transfer with you, right? Like framework knowledge, like a great example, I wrote something like a 5,000 word article on React refs, right? Does that make React lesser? Not really, but like, now I have to remember all those 5,000 words, right? Like that's a lot to keep in mind for one feature of one framework, right? So that's annoying. Relying on a framework can also have its own issues in some ways, right? Like you have to rely on them for maintenance. You have to rely on the team for bugs and security issues. And now you have this dependency and, like there's that whole frustration. There's also the benefit of not using a framework, which is like a smaller hello world, right? I'm not going to say that bigger components are going to be smaller because there's usually a lot of asterisks there. But, for something simple, you don't need the few kilobytes that lit framework might have, right? It works. It's in the browser. Obviously, there are some detriments, some cons, right? So re-rendering, you'll notice that we were using repeat in lit, right? And one of the benefits of repeat that I didn't use is this, where you can pass a second function. So you mark the identifier very similar to like the key property in React or the I forget what it's called in Angular. But what this will allow you to do is that, let's say that you needed to draw these. Now it knows which of these items is which and can redraw only the ones that need to be updated, right? So if I click this checkbox, it will only update that checkbox and not the other elements, right? And that's significant, like by huge margins faster if you're dealing with a large application, right? Re-rendering can be kind of like the death of a big scale application using any component framework, right? Handling events passing is kind of a nightmare in vanilla web components without a framework, right? Like you saw that we had to do add event listener, right? What you didn't see that I didn't add is that we need to do a remove event listener afterwards. And like it's just this whole ordeal, right? When you do that, creating elements can be overly verbose, right? When we had to create the checkbox, we had to do create element input dot type equals checkbox, then this, that, and like, it's not very readable, right? And then finally, binding to props, right? If you need to bind to a property, it's not just dot prop. You need to update you need to document query, you need to do this and this, and again, frustrating, right? They're not easily managed, right? Meanwhile, lit framework, right? Faster re-renders in some circumstances. Re-renders are kind of happen with like, you should know when they re-render, but it kind of handles a lot of that confusion. Great example is that in one of my vanilla JS demos, there was an issue with re-rendering that I had to add a clear in a place that didn't really make sense to me why I had to clear it. Lit handles that all for you. Don't even need to think about it. There's more consolidated UI logic, right? So like my HTML, what I'm binding to my template is pretty obvious, right? You don't have to kind of cipher what a create element does, so on and so forth. And lit framework provides a lot more functionality than what I'm showing today. This is just kind of like a high level overview. The cons are going to be the exact same as the pros here, right? The reliance on the framework adds all these issues. You have to deal with breaking changes. You have to have the knowledge, all that stuff. So, you know, it depends on the application you're working on. There's also other options as well, right? So like lit framework, I think is a pretty cool lightweight wrapper, right? It's doesn't have too many moving parts. So it makes it a nice API to utilize, right? And it's built by the same team that did Polymer, but there's official support in Vue and Angular to build web components that you can use in other applications, whether you are using Vue or Angular. So like say you have an Angular app, right? But one of your teams really wants to use Vue for whatever reason. You can theoretically do that using web components, right? Preact has some pretty good support as well with third-party support. That's not to say that every framework has perfect web component interoperability. That's a word and a half. Some frameworks like React will also have issues, but like there's a pretty good community list right here of custom elements everywhere that explains like what the benefits are of each one of these, what are the detriments, why there might be problems, etc. And this is a pretty up-to-date list. They update it fairly frequently. So that's all that I have for today. I think that was a really fast talk, but that's it. You can find me on Twitter. Please let me know what you thought and ask questions and whatnot. Yeah. I didn't actually time this. This seemed like it was very short though.
This is great. Well, yeah.
Yeah, it was great, man.
Thank you.
Makes me want to play with it.
There's only a few folks here. Ask whatever questions you have.
Yeah.
No need to moderate when it's 4 humans in the room.
Right.
I have a question. It
Yeah.
might be a little more advanced, but so we're using web components, and one of our use cases is we're using Drupal a lot in projects.
Yeah.
Where being able to write things in the shadow DOM help us to prevent the other CMS to override things with CSS.
Right.
Where we get into trouble is we like to use the props and sending a lot of content that the CMS is already preparing really well inside a web component. But then when the prop is very limited for the CSS styling that we can do inside the web component, because you can only do the first level. of styling. Otherwise, the slotted CSS doesn't allow you to go further.
Right.
So what I figured to do, and my question for you is like, how bad is that going to be? Is using JavaScript code to copy the prop, which is still in the light DOM, really,
Right.
into the real shadow DOM. And then I get the full CSS control within the web component, nothing bleeding from the outside, which is what I want. Are there concern in doing something like that? Or when trying to do it I did it in Stencil. Now we switched to Lit 2 because of all the advantages of Lit. And can you give me like a direction of first if there are issues with that, and then
Right.
like where in the Lit life cycle of a component would you do something like that?
So just so that I'm making sure that I understand, are you talking about passing styling? For context for others, you already mentioned this, but web components render inside of what's called the shadow DOM. And the shadow DOM kind of restricts your ability to manipulate components with web components with CSS, which causes all sorts of wonderful, beautiful headaches. That's always good. So are you asking that like you're using JavaScript to pass data via property to set style attributes, or like
No.
attributes, or just styling in general?
So let's say Drupal already creates a great big menu markup.
Right.
I want a web component from menu.
Uh-huh.
And instead of recreating the menu in JavaScript, I let Drupal put all the markup for me. So it's going to be my dash menu web component.
Right.
And inside of it, I'll just let Drupal put the whole menu in there.
Oh, okay.
Now that menu has a nav, has
Right.
UL, LI, all these things. And because it's in the prop itself, as far as I understand, is in the light DOM, even though the whole component is in the shadow DOM.
Right.
And because of that, my styling becomes so limited, and still Drupal can affect it as soon as it's more than one level down.
Right. And okay.
So the idea is to take that prop and literally move it into the shadow DOM itself.
Yeah. I don't know much about that, because I know that there are like slots, right?
Right, using slots, yeah.
Yeah. And that's what I don't know, to be honest. I haven't played around with that exact, like I've done that a few times in like Angular, but Angular has a lot of weird tricks that you can pull that I frankly don't know how to do with like web components, because it relies pretty heavily on like being able to like inspect children's slots, and I don't know what the ability is there. I mean, I guess like at a super simple level you could do like a query param, but I think what you were pointing out is just like adding that slot into the shadow DOM, being able to use the styling there makes sense. Yeah. I just don't know
make
if any
it
of the
part
things
as if it's the original part of
right.
the web component and didn't come from outside.
Right. Yeah, I don't know the benefits or detriments there. I think the only thing that I would be cautious of, if you're recreating the HTML, is making sure that there's no way to access that API publicly, right? Because otherwise, you know, like let's say that your I mean, this is cautiousness with any level of HTML, right? Is you want to make sure to either sanitize it or just not trust end users of any kind, right? Just make sure that cross-site scripting isn't going to be an issue where, you know, you're injecting HTML. Sure, it's in a shadow DOM, but now there's potential security issue, you know? So that's the only thing I can think of, but I don't know, like that would have to be a deeper conversation, which I'm down to have. Like if you like want to shoot me a message on Twitter or like Discord or I don't think I have my Discord on here, but if you want to shoot me a message on Twitter, I'd be happy to like actually have a much more in-depth conversation about this.
Sure. Thank you.
So, yeah.
Have you it's been a while since I've done this type of front-end coding, but we used JSS a while back for with React, and so did that. React works in the shadow DOM, doesn't it?
Not by default.
Okay, I'm trying to remember. It's been a while, but I know we were able to do dynamic CSS at a module, or working with modules using JSS.
Yeah. React, even Angular doesn't really use Shadow DOM. I think there were like plans ages ago to switch it on by default, and there is a way, at least with Angular. I don't think there is for React, at least not without like explicitly making it so, you know. But like a great example, I can actually show. Oh, please let me have a code project that does the thing I want it to do. If it doesn't, I'll give up. But MotionBit CD web, CD get shark website, get status. Okay, so this is a project that used CSS modules with React, very similar to what you're pointing out. And CSS modules is kind of like a different standardization outside of Shadow DOM. Like it's super useful. It's not quite the same. So like here, we're using JSX, right? And then inside of our JSX, you'll notice that we're importing this. It's a SCSS, it's SAS, but it's the same concept. It's using dot module, right? And then inside of here, these are like named, right? So it's play logo and like all this other stuff, right? And then inside of here, we're just using styles dot whatever. And then inside of the actual website, I can type. So I don't do live demos that often. You'll notice that these names are kind of like cores weird. Oh, maybe not. I swore that they were. But at any rate, what ends up happening is that they add like uniqueness so that the scoped, what's called like scope styling, right? And there is a way to do scope styling in lit. It's lit.dev, yeah, lit.dev, and then documentation. No, are these? Where is it? Oh, come on, show me what I want you to do. There we go. So yeah, you can do like CSS, right? Where you're declaring scope CSS that's scoped to this element and doesn't like bleed outside. But if you're trying to impact slots with styling, again, it's just something that I'm not too familiar with. But I'm sure that there is some way to do reactive or reactivity. Like you could probably use, like you said, JSS with styled or lit framework. So there's probably a few different options for dynamic or slot, or not slotted, but stuff. So actually, it seems right here that there is a selector for slotted.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just limited for the first level.
Oh, okay. That's right.
And as soon as you have a deeper one, now it's
Yeah.
taking it from the
Right.
whatever outside is coming.
Right. I think I read about that and then forgot about it. Like I said, definitely down. I would love to like explore that with you and like learn with you and stuff.
That'll be great. Can you show an example of how would you? I think in their example, I saw a lot of inline CSS. Of how would you separate the CSS to a different file and bring it into a lit element? Is that a complex thing? Is that a trivial thing?
So, let's look at this, right? So here they have static styles equal CSS, right? But this is a JavaScript item, right? So like we could theoretically, if we move this up here, sty. We're going to call it sty because that's a cool name. I don't know. So we have const sty, right? And you'll notice that it's still doing the styling as expected, right? So if I had to build a large scale, what I would probably do is very similar to what I do in something like this project, like what I do with all of my like large scale React projects, is that I usually keep my styling in a separate file, unless if it's like really small, you know, like I don't need a separate file for 2 or 3 lines of CSS. I just don't need it. But if I need like dedicated, like at least 100 lines of styling, I'm probably moving it to its own file, right? So you could definitely make this as an export in a separate JavaScript file, and then you can import that. You could even have, like, for example, what I usually do is I'll either have a global class, which like very similar to how like Tailwind does global utility styling, right? But you could also do something like utils.js. And then here you could do export container, right? Container is a pretty standard class. And then here you could have like max width, right, of 10 VH or, you know, whatever. 10 VH is a ridiculous thing, but you get the point is like you could have a centralized JS file that you could export and then individually you could import these together. And I don't know the limitations of this CSS for lit, but I'd be shocked if there isn't a way to combine classes, right? Or combine styles, I guess. So I'm sure that there's something like that, and that's probably how I would do things. So yeah. It's been really interesting exploring this, because I'd used Polymer way back and I hated it. And lit, I legitimately think lit is like a much better incarnation of the ideas that were originally laid out. So it's been interesting, like, because I used Polymer like before I even really knew what I was doing, and it was like this brand new flashy thing that even like experienced developers were kind of confused at, because it was new and it wasn't well documented. And coming back like 7 years later, like, oh, hey, I know what I'm doing now. It's been a really interesting experience.
One of the interesting things we do is extending components. Yeah, it's very helpful.
Yeah, and like what's really cool is that like this render function, right? You could even like extend and re-implement a lot of how the base functionality of lit works, right? So like you could build your own like modular renderer or like a base component that provides some special functionality in these. And in fact, if you look at like the really early days of, say, like React, right? There was something called mix-ins, right? And very similar to Vue. Vue also had mix-ins. I even think, and someone please call me on this if I'm wrong, I want to say AngularJS had mix-ins too, where you had like a base class that provided like lifecycle methods, right? And then in those lifecycle methods, they would do some cleanup and whatever. And then that's how you would be able to do things like nowadays you have like hooks or Vue 3 compositions, right? But that's how you originally would do things like add functionality of like use mouse, right? Where's the mouse pointing in my component? You could build a base class that listened for where the mouse was and then pass that data to render, something along those lines. So yeah, there's a lot of interesting ways that you can kind of build on top of lit. And I think that like one of the arguments that I had when I was like vanilla web components, you don't have to do framework knowledge. Here's the secret con that's not listed here, but should probably be listed here. You're going to end up building lit anyway, because you want those abstractions, right? Like, if you're really dealing with componentization, you're not going to write that every time you need a checkbox. There's no way. No way, right? Like that's easily 30 lines of code for what is easily one line of HTML, right? So I've seen this happen before. It's like, oh, we don't want to use React. We're going to build something in-house. And then in-house becomes this huge Orwellian nightmare where, they don't have the capability to build things as big as, Google. Not to say that their decisions are perfect, but it's like, you're going to build abstractions anyways. Might as well use something that's standard. I don't know. So.
Have you used lit in any professional projects?
No. But I've seen other people like give like show and tells of it, right? I think one of the coolest show and tells was that someone had combined lit with D3, and there was a way, like back before lit became a huge framework, when it was just called lit HTML, and all it was a way to do like this HTML stuff. It didn't include any of the rest of this. They had built something that was basically a React renderer for a 3D AR or VR game, and it worked really well. like it was like this whole like 2-hour presentation that I went to. I was like, whoa, like you did this with web components? Like I didn't see that coming, but okay. But yeah, I just haven't had the chance yet to work with this in a more professional capacity. Although I am technically representing my company, right? So you could say maybe. So, but yeah,
Um,
this is why like the slotting knowledge that I have is very limited compared to say Angular. You know, I worked in Angular professionally for like 3-4 years. So
is CoderPad then done in Inlet or?
no.
Oh, okay.
CoderPad, our stack is mainly Ruby and React.
Okay.
And I'm not, it's not that I'm not allowed to touch the code base, but I haven't yet touched the code base. I've read the code base and that's it. So
I think EA.com is a really nice example of a site full of web components.
right. And I mean, like I said, YouTube is still web components, right? Like if we go to YouTube right now, it's going to show that. I don't know why. I literally have never watched this video. I got to rant about this for like 2 seconds. I've never, ever watched this video. Not saying that Harper Valley PTA is a bad song. I've never watched this video. And yet every time I type in YouTube into my search box, it always brings me to this video. And I don't know why. Like I've cleared my search history. Anyways, random. But yeah, if you look, you'll notice that all these are custom web components, right? So like they built this originally with Polymer. I'd be shocked if they're not using something similar to Polymer or Lit nowadays, you know? But yeah, all of YouTube, which is what they have easily millions of minutes of video uploaded every few hours or whatever, you know? So it can definitely handle at scale.
Do you have extensions you can recommend when using VS Code for working with Lit?
Yeah, so Lit in particular actually has they have their template. Where is it? I swear I know how to navigate their website by now. I promise. It's one of these. Where is it? Come on. Project generator? No. Oh, come on. They have boilerplate, or not a boilerplate, but like it has like all the VS Code extensions pre-installed using the .VS Code. Starter, there we go, starter kits. Yeah, they have some pretty good starter kits, and in their starter kits, they even mention where is it? Of course, they don't mention it, but in their starter kit, they have VS Code extensions that are pre-installed when you open the project. Or rather, it will recommend you to install them, I should say. How do I send a chat message to Zoom now?
Yeah, you need to find that. The two Windows probably.
No, I'm on Mac, but like, there we go, chat. So, yeah.
Thank you.
So, and the cool part about Lit, I've only been showing the JavaScript version because like, I think that's where like Lit makes them, not just Lit, but I think like web components make the most sense when you have like this modular environment where you kind of piecemeal your application, you know, like a what they call like a macro front end or whatever, right? Where you're putting in web components in something like you were pointing out, like Drupal or WordPress or even another React application or, you know, whatever. Like, I think that's where web components make the most sense. But if you want to use TypeScript, you can reduce your syntax by a ton. Like this is the JavaScript, which is 25 lines of code. This is the TypeScript, which is 15 and uses decorators. So, I mean, if you're comfortable with using TypeScript, that's a pretty big difference in syntax. So,
yeah. Do you have a recommendation about tooling or what to use instead of Webpack?
Well, they use Rollup as their like official starter kit, and I really like Rollup. I think that the people who make it are pretty darn neato, at least with my limited interactions with them. And Rollup just like, it's so, not only is it really fast, but it's so much nicer to set up plugins and configurations. Like only now, after 7 years of web development, am I kind of sort of okay with configuring Webpack, right? And that's only because I've like had to die at the hands of Webpack through like 8 different projects, right? Like it's miserable. Like Webpack configuration is legitimately, I think, the hardest thing that you can ever do. I'd rather write Webpack than configure it, right? And I've never had that issue with Parcel. Like Parcel is like, oh, hey, I can read this configuration file and understand what's happening. That's fantastic. Thank you. So, but you'll actually notice CoderPad, we use just web browsers, right? We don't manipulate your code using like Webpack or anything, at least not yet. And like if you look at our demo, you'll notice that we're not importing from, like, in our code in the slides we mentioned importing from, I think I have it, one of these. You'll see that we are importing from lit here, right? But we're not actually doing that in CoderPad. We're importing from a CDN, and it just works. Like, it works really well. And that's the really cool part, is that, like, nowadays with JavaScript modules, right, you can use this import syntax. This is built into the browser now. This isn't, I'm not using Webpack here. I'm not using Rollup. I'm not using anything fancy. You can save this to an HTML text file, open it, and it runs perfectly. So I don't know. There's a lot of different options. There's also, if you want to go that route, but you still want to do like local bundling of your files, right? But you still want to use like the modules, there's something called Snowpack. Snowpack is a way to kind of like utilize the built-in ESM import syntax, but instead of relying on a CDN, which I think most web developers nowadays are pretty against, because uptime is a thing. Snowpack is a good like middle ground between those. So I'll link that in chat too.
Are there any bottlenecks when using web components, or like things to avoid?
Yeah, the biggest one is really, where is it? It's basically don't use inner HTML, just don't. And what I mean by that is, like, you know, if you need to use inner HTML for a one-off thing or whatever, that's fine. But don't do what we were doing earlier, where we're literally writing a huge UL and LI with inner HTML. So non-performant, because what you're doing there is you're literally destroying every element in your tree and then reconstructing every element in your tree. There's like, first of all, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that there's probably focus state issues, which brings up a whole host of accessibility problems where like it moves your focus state when you're trying to use keyboard navigation. I haven't tested that, so that browsers might be handling that in some fancy way. But then you're like literally re-rendering everything every time. Like it's just this performance nightmare. Like I have seen applications crawl to their knees because they were re-rendering things that they didn't need to re-render. So, and this is why, like, if you actually spend a lot of time with lit, you'll notice that like they have is it guard? I don't know if guard is the right one. But they have like the ability to cache stuff, and they have the ability to, man, I would love to see any of the demos that I'm talking about, but like there's the ability to like essentially memoize your UI and be able to only increment the elements that need incrementing. And that's a huge performance boon. And in fact, if you look at like their homepage, they literally even mention like one of their main selling points is, look, it's fast. You don't have to you don't have to build a virtual tree and diff it, like, because that's how React works. That's how Lit works. That's how basically every framework works, is because updating the DOM en masse is super slow. You don't want to do it if you can avoid it. So yeah, I think that's the biggest call out. And that's the advice I have, whether you're working with web components or React or whatever else. Some frameworks, you're able to kind of think about it a lot less. I think like there's kind of a spectrum of how much you have to worry about that problem in particular, right? I think on the most worry about, you need like something like web components, right? Where you might be doing this manipulation without even realizing it. On the least spectrum, maybe something like Vue, where they have a pretty good system of like, okay, we know when you want to render and not based on proxies and other stuff. And then kind of like in the middle ground is something like React, where like you can let most things re-render without too much problems, but eventually you'll probably need to get into use callback and use memo to cache those UI elements. So
would you be able to share your slideshow?
Yeah, I don't have it. Let me duplicate this. Sure. Yes, tell you what. How do I want to do that? Let me think about that.
If you want to just shoot me a link whenever you get a chance, and then I'll post the link to the slides on our Twitter and on the YouTube channel and stuff like that.
And we can also post it to the meetup I can add it as a comment there.
Perfect.
So that works. Okay, cool. Sorry, I'm only worried about it because my company will be like, you're sharing what externally? And it's like, guys, it's a slideshow. Like, I'm not here to share our secrets, you know, but I do have to be careful there because it is on our main thing. So let me think about that for a second.
Any other questions from anyone?
That was great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Corbin. Appreciate it, man.
Thank you.
How long
Corbin put this presentation together by request. I asked him a couple months ago, like, hey, could you do this? And he said, sure. And now we have this wonderful talk on web components for us. So thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Anytime.
Anybody have any other questions before we wrap it up? No. All right. Offer, thanks for joining us all the way from Florida. Appreciate it. Thanks for being here. Everyone else, have a good night, and we'll see you next month.
All right. See ya.
Thank you so much.